Welcome, one and all, those present here at the Irvine Auditorium and those watching over Zoom. I am delighted and honored to have the opportunity this evening to introduce Professor Graham Hubbs for what promises to be a stimulating discussion on money, debt, and usury. Lest we forget, Dante placed usurers on the lowest rung of the seventh circle of hell, so we would all do well to pay close attention to this talk. Dr. Hubbs is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Department of Politics and Philosophy at the University of Idaho, where he has delivered a striking array of courses on everything from ancient and medieval philosophy to business ethics to existentialism to philosophy of mind and much else in between. And Dr. Hubbs' publications and presentations are equally impressive in scope, ranging over numerous areas of social and political philosophy and practical rationality. Dr. Hubbs is also the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including recently a mid-career faculty award from his home university, given in recognition of his commitment to outstanding scholarship, teaching, and engagement. Now, when it comes to his scholarship, if there is one topic nearest and dearest to Dr. Hubbs' heart, it would clearly be the history and nature of money, which he examines as an instance of collective intentionality. His deep probing work on money and all matters of collective intentionality grows out of his work on practical rationality, to which he takes a neo-Aristotelian approach, as if there were any other. Thus, it should come as no surprise that much of Dr. Hubbs' extensive writing on practical rationality centers on the work of Elizabeth Anscombe, hence the exciting title of tonight's talk. Before concluding, I should also mention that Dr. Hubbs is a senior member of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, an organization devoted to cross-disciplinary collaboration in research and practice, and he recently co-edited a book of the same name. For the sake of getting me away from here so that Dr. Hubbs can begin, I would simply encourage anyone who hasn't heard of TDI to go to their website and read all about their fascinating and path-breaking work. Dr. Hubbs received his bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, from Washington University in St. Louis in philosophy and Italian, and he received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. So, Dr. Hubbs.
Thank you so much for those very, very, very kind words. I really appreciate it. I want to thank everyone at the Collegium Institute for my stay here the last few days working in the Anscombe archive. It's been a really, really neat experience. I'm really appreciative of it. I'd also like to thank the folks at the Kislak Center Reading Room who facilitated being able to look at the documents in the archive, and the University of Pennsylvania's philosophy department for their support of this talk as well. Okay, let me give you a little bit of background on this talk. It was very nice of John to mention TDI. It's right there in the middle. Colleague of mine named Joseph Tingley has a project on philosophers and money. It's a 2-volume set that will be coming out of Palgrave when it gets written, so in a couple of years or so. And Joe recently won an award from the NEH to host a conference on the topic this summer, where we'll be doing some toolbox work. But anyone who is interested in this, who gets engaged with the topic, be in touch with me and I'll put you in touch with Joe. We're going to be having a digital or a remote and digital aspect to the conference so that as many people can attend as possible. So if the talk is gripping, be in touch with me about this. Joe reached out to me because he knew of my 2 interests in Anscombe and on money, and said, would you like to write the chapter on Anscombe and money? And I said, yes, that seems like a great fusion of my research interests. So the one place to go to look for Anscombe's own discussion on the nature of money is an essay that was unpublished in her lifetime, Philosophers and Economists, 2 Philosophers' Objections to Usury, which the footnote at the bottom, which you probably can't read, said that she gave to the General Seminar at Cambridge in November of 1970. It did not appear until the St. Andrews Studies Collected Works came out in volume 2. But it has an extended discussion of money and usury, the philosophy of economics. So it was a perfect text to be working off of while doing the project for Joe's volume. I came here to the archive to see if I could learn a little bit more about this essay, what was going on around the essay, what kinds of notes she was taking and thinking about at the time. I didn't find much, at least this go around. There is in a notebook that she's writing in at the same time, this quote from Marx, which to my knowledge is the only time I've seen her quoting Marx, but are there more than that, Joe?
I think, yeah, at least that.
Okay. Anyway, while she is writing this essay that she's going to present on debt and usury, we have this quote: "The human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual in its reality. It is the ensemble of social relations." But this doesn't end up informing the paper that she ends up presenting on debt and usury. So I'm still left to a little bit of a mystery about what kind of research she was doing at the time that would help us better understand why she got interested in the topic and what she delivered. I'm particularly keen. I didn't find any letters between her and Joan Robinson. I was hoping to see that. Joe, are there any? Oh, okay, great. Well, so the gap in knowledge remains, but nevertheless, the time working in the archive was lovely. So my talk then will end up focusing on her paper that everyone can read in the collective volumes. The central thesis of the paper that she wants to explore is up here. After spending the first couple pages discussing Aristotle's and Aquinas's views of debt and usury, she gets on to what I think she's really concerned about. She says, how is it that the Catholic Church, which condemned usury in unretractable terms as late as 1745, should have fallen silent about it? And further, how is it to all economists the objection makes complete nonsense? So she conducts her, I guess here she's telling us why she got interested in it, but we still don't see much of the background about what drove her to care about these questions. So this is the topic of her essay. Now, my agenda today is going to be to look at the stuff at the front of the essay on Aristotle's views of money and usury and Aquinas's views of usury and money, because I think those are a rich resource for thinking through contemporary issues, in particular on the ontology of money. That's going to be the majority of the talk. I do want to spend some time investigating what for her was one of the major points of the talk, which is her analysis of the Economist's view of usury. I'm out of my waters talking about the history of the Catholic Church, so I'm not going to address that part of her essay. I will wrap up by suggesting some connections between the remarks that she makes about all of these topics and broader themes in her practical philosophy. Okay, so we'll start where she starts, unsurprisingly, which is with Aristotle. So Aristotle's account of usury comes out of his account of money. Money is an artifact. It's not a natural kind. It's something that's created by humans to serve some purpose and to perform some function. Because it's an artifact, it is defined by its telos, its goal, its function, its end. And what is the telos of money? At least in the Politics, Aristotle has the following to say. And the Politics is the text that we want to look at because it's the one that Anscombe is looking at, and it is the account of money that ends up informing Aquinas's subsequent discussion. Aristotle says that though importing what they needed and exporting their surplus, people doing those things, people increasingly got their supplies from more distant foreign sources. Since not all the natural necessities are easily transportable, the use of money had of necessity to be devised. So as far as the Politics goes, the telos is to serve as a medium of exchange. I'm emphasizing that this is the account in the Politics as opposed to the other place where Aristotle talks about money, which is in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, Chapter 5. Because there's very interesting work by Stefan Eich coming out in his book that'll be released this summer, where in Stefan's chapter on Aristotle and money, he points out that the word for money in the Politics is kremata, whereas it's nuisma in the Ethics, and that these two different meanings indicate two different ways that Aristotle thinks about money, depending upon the function that money is playing in the, the concept of money is playing in the account that he's giving and the function that money has in the state as opposed to in the market. Stefan also notes that in English, this distinction has been glossed over by translating both of these terms as money, so that you might think, reading the English translations, that Aristotle is talking about one and the same thing. I think that this is a good thing for us to keep track of. So I want to be clear that we're just talking about the view that comes out in the politics, not in the ethics. Okay. After defining money as a medium of exchange that helps trade, Aristotle goes on to talk about usury. Because money's proper use is determined by its telos, which again is to help ameliorate the inconveniences of exchange, other uses of money are going to be deviant. One example that's not Aristotle's is gambling, right? When you use money to take money away from other people in a dice game or a card game or something like that, you're not using it as a medium of exchange. You're using it as an instrument of play, gambling, something like that. That's not what its function is, and so it's deviant if we think that any use of money beyond its defined use by its telos is deviant. The example that Aristotle does strike on is lending money out at interest, which is the definition of usury that he's using. An aside, Anscombe is interested in the traditional definition of usury here, which is any lending at interest, not the definition that has come to be the standard English definition and starting sometime in the last 200 or 300 years, which is lending at exorbitant interest. Traditionally, any lending at interest was treated as usury. This is the topic that Aristotle has in mind when he's talking about usury as being deviant. The bit from this quote that I want is at the very end there, where he says that this use of money as a mechanism by which it's going to create new money through the production of interest on the back of a loan is unnatural. Aristotle uses the term natural to capture a wide variety of phenomena, but I think that a way to get a flavor of the kind of unnaturalness that he's thinking about here is to think about the way that cancer is nature gone wrong in some way. When we make money through collecting interest on interest-bearing loans, there's a kind of cancerous growth coming out of using something in a way that it is not supposed to be used. Not Aristotle's image, but I think it gets at what he wants in describing making money through interest as unnatural. So Anscombe summarizes Aristotle's view correctly here. I think she's got him on the mark. And then she goes on to say, after summarizing the view that I just presented, textbookily, money is called, and now she's going to list what in the economic textbooks of her days, the three characteristic or defining functions of money: a standard of value or a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a store of wealth. When we're thinking about money as a standard of value or unit of account, we're thinking about money types in the abstract, which can be used to price contracts, to price goods. If you want to set the price of, if I wanted to set the price of my computer at $500, in saying that it has the quality of being $500, I'm not saying that there's like $500 stuffed in the machine somewhere for you to discover. I'm using the concept of the unit of account of the dollar in order to characterize it as having a certain amount of wealth, which then if you agree to pay me for it, then you're going to have to discharge the debt either in that unit of account or in something equivalent to it. So she sets aside talking about the abstract concept of a unit of account because she says it doesn't make sense to speak of rent on a unit of account. And what she's interested in thinking through the wrongness of usury as that it's a mistaken or bad kind of rent in some way. And she notes that Aristotle's objection seems to be that you can't really speak of rent on a medium of exchange. She's correct. He's focused on money as a medium of exchange, and that is the direction that his account takes. The final clause in this sentence, but someone might say, why not a rent on a store of wealth? She's imagining the defender of usury looking for a way out of Aristotle's attack and is saying, fine, Aristotle, maybe there is something wrong about using money or charging a rent on money when money is conceived of as a medium of exchange, but it's also a store of value. So what's so wrong about charging rent on a store of value? For that, she turns to Aquinas. She thinks that Aquinas's argument about the problems of usury is designed to address money as a store of value and show what would be wrong about charging a rent on that. The focus for her is on the Summa Theologica, the second part, in question 78, which is all concerned with usury. There are several arguments against the legitimacy of usury that occur in this question. And one of them is the one that I think maybe gets the most immediate grip on us today. And you might have expected Anscombe to be talking about, given that she's interested in the ethics of usury. The clause that Aquinas is going to object to is as follows. Anyone may lawfully accept a thing which its owner freely gives him. Now he who accepts the loan freely gives the usury. Therefore, he who lends may lawfully take the usury. This is the target argument that Aquinas wants to argue against. And he says what I expect to everyone here, that you predict he's going to say, that when someone takes out a loan at either any kind of interest or at a high rate of interest, they're not acting freely. There's something about their circumstances that compels them to take out a loan under terms that they would not if they weren't under those circumstances. And so the response goes, people who accept loans of this sort do so under a certain necessity, insofar as they need to borrow money, which the owner is unwilling to lend without usury. Okay. One of the things that's interesting about this argument, which Anscombe is, again, this is not going to be her focus in Aquinas, is that in this particular text, Aquinas is suppressing an image from Aristotle that comes to dominate discussions of usury for the next century. And that is the image that Aristotle gives us in the first book, or the first chapter of book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, of the ship captain who has to throw cargo over ship to keep the boat from sinking because the storms are really bad. We might say, did the ship captain voluntarily throw the cargo overboard? Well, in some sense, the ship captain deliberated rationally and did what was going to be best for the lives of everybody involved in the ship. But he did so under the duress of the storm. Had the storm not been there, he and the crew would not have been throwing stuff overboard. So it provides a nuance for distinguishing between different kinds or degrees of voluntariness. And Aquinas specifically references this image in the discussion of usury in De Malo, which is much longer than the discussion that he gives in the Summa Theologica. Odd Langholm's 4th chapter of The Legacy of Scholasticism and Economic Thought from 1998 has a really nice discussion of this. And in particular, the way that the image, as it comes through the tradition in De Malo, comes to be the kind of thing that subsequent scholars talking about usury and what's wrong with usury will seize upon. Oh, what's wrong about usury is that it's not voluntary. And the reasons that it's not voluntary is that it's just like throwing your cargo overboard if you're in the midst of a storm. Okay, I say all of that because it's in the background of part of what Aquinas is thinking about in the Summa, but it's not, and so it's worth knowing about, but it is not where Anscombe goes. So highlighting Anscombe's view by relief of contrast. Here's where she goes. She goes to what Aquinas himself presents as the central argument in question 78 for what's wrong about usury. And I'm going to read Aquinas' own words here in their totality. To take usury for money lent is unjust in itself because this is to sell what does not exist. It's a metaphysical argument. It's not an argument that has anything to do with volition. Rather, one is selling something that does not exist. This is the claim. And this evidently leads to inequality, which is contrary to justice. In order to make this evident, it's argument by analogy, we must observe that there are certain things, the use of which consists in their consumption. Thus, we consume wine when we use it for drink, and we consume wheat when we use it for food. Wheretofore, in such like things, the use of the thing must not be reckoned apart from the thing itself, and whoever is granted to the use of the thing is granted the thing itself, and for this reason, to lend of this kind is to transfer the ownership. Accordingly, if a man wanted to sell wine separately from the use of the wine, I'll break this all down in a second, but let's absorb the text first, and then I'll try to gloss the argument. If a person wanted to sell wine separately from the use of the wine, he would be selling the same thing twice, or he would be selling what does not exist. Again, this is the metaphysical punch of the argument. Wheretofore, he would evidently commit the sin of injustice. On like manner, he commits an injustice who lends wine or wheat and asks for double payment, one in return of the thing in equal measure, the other for the price of use, which is called usury. Okay, here's my gloss of what the argument about selling wine is supposed to be. A way through thinking why it would be an injustice to charge rent on the wine, or to charge an extra payment beyond what the value of wine is. So suppose I have a case of wine, and one night you need a bottle, and I give you one, and maybe it's Aquinas wine that I've got, and this is what you come over and take at the end of the night. Now, what is a fair return for the bottle that I have lent you? The question about usury comes up in the broader context of Aquinas' discussions about justice. So what he's really interested in here, I think, is what is the just return on this kind of loan? What would serve as an equivalent for the bottle of wine? And the answer is the obvious answer. What is equivalent to this bottle of Aquinas is a bottle of the same quality and quantity, another bottle of the Aquinas wine. To charge you for the use of the wine, saying, no, I don't need just the bottle of wine back because I didn't just give you the bottle, but you also used it. And I want you to pay for having used it and not just for the bottle itself. To charge you for the use of the wine as well for the wine itself is, on Aquinas' view, usury, because the way that the wine is used and what it is to possess the wine involves using it up. And so this is the key thing, that this key bit of language that Anscombe is going to focus on in the Aquinas formulation, that to use a consumable good up, when one does that, they have made full use of the property in question. And these things are identical to one another. There's not, even though we can bring them under different descriptions, there's not two different things here. So to charge for the wine itself as if it were separate from being used up is a metaphysical mistake. It's charging for something that doesn't exist because there's only one thing here. Okay, that's the intuition behind where the rest of this argument is going to go. That the wine itself and using the wine up are one and the same thing. So to charge anything above and beyond the return of the wine when it comes back, the thought is like it could only be for the use, but you can't charge for the use because there's nothing separate about the use itself. All right. Note here that the way that I did this example to try to get you in the mindset where there is something right about thinking that a just return for lending the bottle of wine just is exactly the same bottle in return. My loan didn't involve any opportunity cost on my part. I have a whole case in my basement. I'm in bad shape if I drink all other 11 bottles and still find myself wanting to drink a 12th one. I'm not going to miss the bottle that I lent to you if you return it to me before I need it. Something that is missing here that an economically minded person might point out, though, is that I didn't account for the risk of you not bringing the wine back or not coming back at all. And that this might be the kind of thing that it's appropriate to charge above and beyond the cost of the wine itself. I've got some thoughts about what Anscombe thinks about risks that are shaky, and you have to know a lot about Anscombe to see where this might be coming from. It has to do with remarks she makes at the end of intention. In the paper itself, she calls risk a magic formula and a monstrosity, but it's one of these spots where she doesn't tell you why she thinks that, and it's left to you to piece it together. If people are sufficiently interested in this, we can come back to it in Q&A. Okay, so back to Aquinas. Aquinas notes that not everything in the world that is owned is used by using it up. For example, if you own a dwelling place, when you use it, you don't consume it and use it up. And those kinds of things, by their categorical distinction from the kinds of property that the use is to use up, Aquinas thinks it may be appropriate to charge rent on because there is something beyond the dwelling itself if someone is occupying it that they take advantage of. So there's a categorical distinction in Aquinas between consumable goods, which are not appropriate for charging rent on, Hence, any rent would be usury, and non-consumable goods like dwelling places. All right, so what does this have to do with money? Here's how Aquinas ties the threads together. Money, according to the philosopher, that's Aristotle, was invented chiefly for the purpose of exchange, as we saw in the politics passage. And consequently, the proper and principal use of money, Aquinas says, is its consumption or alienation whereby it is sunk in exchange. So what is it to use money? Aquinas is saying here to use it is to alienate it. And what he means by this is for most consumable things, when I use them, I do not alienate them. So if I've got a bottle of wine, to alienate it would be to hand it to one of you. I have this relinquished my, and to do so voluntarily and to hand over the property rights of the thing to you. That is what it means to alienate it. With wine, I don't, when I'm using it as wine, its use is in its consumption. But money, you don't consume that way. Its definitive use is by alienating it. It is by giving it away that you get what you were supposed to get out of the money in the first place. So that's what makes money a particularly strange kind of consumable commodity from Aquinas' point of view. It's the one whose use requires its alienation, as opposed to all the other consumable commodities whose use precludes alienation. Once I've alienated, I can't use it anymore, right? So that's what makes money the strange kind of beast that it is. Now, here's the conclusion that he wants to draw. Hence, it is by its very nature unlawful to take payment for the use of money lent, which payment is known as usury. And just as man is bound to restore other ill-gotten goods, so he is bound to restore the money which he has taken in usury. Okay, those are Aquinas' words. Let's go back to Anscombe. Here is her gloss on that passage that I just read. Now, St. Thomas says that money is a consumable good, which is used up and dispersed in being spent. That is, you are not to consider the money that you lent as existing once someone has spent it, any more than a loaf of bread once someone has eaten it, or a bottle of wine once someone has drunk it. The idea here is that if I hand you a gold coin for something in exchange, the gold coin has been used up and spent and exhausted, and it is not the same gold coin in your hand than it was in mine because it has been used up and spent. Now, I'm going to confess, I think that this is a pretty odd idea, and so I will be talking about the oddness of the idea here in a second. But I do think that Anscombe is getting Aquinas right here in interpreting this business about using up in the way that she is. So this enables us to answer the objection, why can't one charge a rent on a sum of money considered as a store of wealth? Remember, this is where we started. The defender of usury against Aristotle's argument was turning to thinking about money as a store of wealth and was saying, well, there's nothing wrong with charging rent on that. Aquinas' argument on Anscombe's reading is meant to target that understanding of money and the defensive usury that would be advocated on its back. The answer would be, Anscombe says, money of a store of wealth is comparable to seed as a store of crop life. Seed, like money, can be kept for a long time and used at any time, but if the seed is used, planted to grow a crop, it dies and does not exist anymore. So you could ask for the share in a crop or a greater amount of seed if it was used to make more seed, but if it was just a loan of so much seed, all you can ask for is the same quantity back. Again, where the real sort of guiding question here is, what's the just return on the loan? Okay, now, how exactly is this supposed to answer the objection to usury? Remember, this was meant to show that there is something problematic somehow with charging rent on a loan of money when we're considering the money a store of wealth or value. But isn't a coin exactly not like a seed or a bottle of wine in the relevant ways? I mean, even by Aquinas' own definition, isn't it not that way? Isn't the strangeness of money of its use being in its alienation make, if you want to call it a consumable good, unlike every other imaginable consumable good, precisely because the very thing, the very coin persists through the exchange? And doesn't it store its value precisely because it never gets used up? Again, I think that I think that Anscombe's gloss of Aquinas is correct here, but thinking that what this is showing is that there's something either flatly unintelligible or at least paradoxical about the notion of charging rent on something as a store of value or a store of wealth. My intuitions, at least initially, run in exactly the opposite direction. I'll try to bail Anscombe out a little bit here at the end, but if you're thinking that to spend money is not to use up the money, but just to like move it somewhere else, I share your sympathies. Okay, Anscombe does not take up the challenge that explicitly that I just presented. Instead, she moves on to say the following, which I think constitutes a recognition that something fishy is going on here. And behind this recognition, it's an invitation to dig deeper into a lot of interesting things about this discussion. That's her word. She says, it is interesting that those philosophers, and so she has in mind here Aquinas and Aristotle, to whom money was certainly physical gold and silver, should have refused to regard it as a permanent commodity, but said it was no such thing, concentrating on the character in regard to which it is an abstraction. If her reading of Aquinas is right, then to think that when a physical piece of metal shifts from my hand over to your hand in exchange, the money that I had has been used up and now some new money has been grown on your part. There's not one coin and one store of value, but one store of value being extinguished in my hand and a new one growing up in your hand. Does require us, I think, to think about money in the abstract, because that's not looking at the physical piece of metal that's shifting hands, what has gone on. If I'm right that she's got Aquinas right, I think she's exactly right that like he finds nothing problematic about thinking in money in this highly abstract way, even though she suggests coin was the only thing that he possibly could have thought about when he thought about concrete instances of money. And she goes on to say, whereas we, to whom money really is practically nothing but a mental construction, paper notes and checks. I mean, she's writing this before there's digital money in the form of credit card ledgers and computers and Bitcoin and all that, but it only gets more abstract as history goes along, should be so clear that it is a permanent commodity. Okay, I think it is interesting. I think that she's got her finger on something quite interesting here, even though she doesn't press it very far. First, the idea that money's use requires its alienation, which uses it by using it up, does not seem to be in Aristotle. I think that she's right that Aquinas' argument against usury is quite different than the one that Aristotle provides, and that the difference there turns on this difference on the notion of money. Aristotle focusing on it as a medium of exchange. So if you use it for anything other than a medium of exchange, like gambling or charging interest, then you've done something unnatural. Aquinas' argument doesn't read that way at all. It's about charging rent on something that doesn't exist at all. And I think that Aquinas can only get there if he does have this different view of money in mind than the one that Aristotle has. Where historically it comes up between Aquinas and Aristotle, I don't know, but there's something new going on there. Now, aspects of this idea that one of the defining characteristics of money is that its use is through its alienation, this idea persists for centuries, but seems to disappear at some point in the 19th century. Kant's discussion of money in the metaphysics of morals, for example, takes the idea that money is used by alienating it as its point of departure. Kant credits Gottfried Okenwald with the idea, but one can imagine that Okenwald is just getting it from the scholastic tradition, and so that there is a line that you can run from Aquinas all the way to Kant on the nature of money. But as I just said, it does seem to disappear at some point in the discussion of the Austrian economists at the end of the 19th century, and then some of the debates that they get into with their opponents in the historical school. This point about alienation just doesn't show up anymore as part of the definition. Here, I think Anscombe's right. That's interesting. Finally, there's possibly a good explanation for why medieval folks like Aquinas would have been comfortable with thinking about money as an abstraction. And that is that people were very familiar with using money as a unit of account, even in the absence of not just central bank paper money, which is what Anscombe thinks of mind. Anscombe is thinking, if you didn't have central bank paper money, wouldn't you be tempted to think about money as a commodity because all that is circulating around is physical stuff like gold, silver, bronze, what have you? Scholars have known for decades at least that for long stretches in the Middle Ages, there was just not a lot of physical metal in circulation. And yet markets thrived just fine because people used the abstract notion of whatever their monetary unit was in order to set prices, set debts, and then to clear them. So in fact, they were quite comfortable with money as an abstraction because that's the way that you use the concept of money when you don't actually have a lot of circulating coin. It's not Anscombe's fault that she didn't know that, but it does explain partially why a medieval writer like Aquinas working on money wouldn't have had much trouble thinking about it in these abstract terms. Okay, so I'm on track, I'm on schedule. So I'm going to turn now after that discussion of how these remarks on the ontology of money interestingly relate to the history of theorizing about the ontology of money, which can bear on our own thinking about the ontology of money. I want to turn to the rest of Anscombe's lecture, which is again, having made these remarks about the different ways that Aquinas and Aristotle think about money and how they inform their arguments against usury, why it is that I'm going to skip the bit about the church again and move on to her concern with economists who think that Aquinas's argument is absurd in some way. Now, the absurdity that they seize on, according to Anscombe, or the one that she wants to treat, it may be that contemporary economists of her day seized on all sorts of absurdities when it came to usury, but the one that she's most concerned to probe is the idea that distinguishing getting a return on investment in general, which you might be able to do if you invest in an enterprise and then an enterprise makes a bunch of profit and then you take some share of the profits, that idea is different from charging interest merely on a loan. She thinks that this is the thing that when you present it to the economists of her day, they will say, no, there is just interest. It doesn't matter whether it's on returns from an enterprise going well or simply charging interest on the loan. No difference here whatsoever. And the fact that Aquinas and other medieval thinkers drew a distinction here means that any argument based on that distinction is going to be fallacious. And since their arguments for against usury rather turn on that distinction, there's just nothing to them. We don't have to, they're absurd. We don't have to pay any attention to them. Okay. Anscombe goes and reads Keynes. She talks to Joan Robinson. She can't figure out why economists can't see this difference that she thinks is crystal clear between a return on investment if an enterprise is profitable from demanding oh God, I've been up here too long. What's the word I'm looking for? Interest on a loan. She says, I remain perplexed by the utter failure of economists to see any point in the objection to usury. For it appeared to me that I could understand well enough the distinction between investing in a capital venture with a view to sharing the profits if it should succeed and demanding interest on the mere strength of a loan. Now, in the essay, she says that the lights went off when she went back to the classicals and started reading Ricardo. I'm going to try to do this as simply as possible for the sake of time, but it gets at what Anscombe's fundamental critique about the worldview of the economists that she was talking to is and how it informs their inability to see the distinctions that is necessary to get the medieval argument against usury off the ground. And that is, I'm slightly modifying her language here, what she almost calls the shop window effect. So the shop window effect, as described by Anscombe, goes like this. Imagine that you go by a store and it has a sort of code in the shop window, and then the store next door wants to sell exactly the same code. Well, that's true. Then the store next door can't charge either anymore. It's the same code. It's right next door. Maybe you could charge an extra $1 or $2 and get away with it if there was like something a little nicer about being in the store. It was a little cleaner, the lights were a little better, but you're not going to be able to charge a great deal more when the stores are right next to one another, and it would be just as easy to go into one as it is to go into the other. She says when choices have this structure, then the deciding factor will at least often be simply maximizing return on investment. We have to stick often in there. If you know that the owner of the one shop has politics that you disdain, you may never buy anything for them, no matter how expensive it is in the other store. hold all those things constant. Imagine that the owners, you roughly know the same thing about them, and you have the same view about them, and the store is roughly the same. You're going to buy the less expensive one. That's what practical rationality would tell you to do in that kind of circumstance. Anscombe's thought is that economists, at least since Ricardo, theorize about the world in its totality as if every decision is a shop window decision. This, she says, provides a picture in which the obvious thing to do with any money is to lay it out to make as much more money as markets allowed. That if you did anything else with it, it would be conscious extravagance or conscious philanthropy, hallmarks of irrationality. She says, whereas it would seem to me proper to think that if you had some spare money, it would be reasonable to do something else. Say, build a house, just because a house was required in this place. And it was part of your function when you had the disposal of some spare money to do that sort of thing with it. Now, I think that in the background of that response to this idea that economists walk around the world and see the world as one giant shop window in which to maximize return on investment, and her own response being like, I don't know, maybe the house needs to be over there and I've got some extra money, why wouldn't I build it? I think that her response draws in part on, and you knew there couldn't be a talk about Anscombe that got all the way through it without mentioning intention, which I think I've already mentioned once. Her discussion of suitability as a desirability characteristic in practical reasoning. Here's what goes on in the relevant swath of intention. In section 37, she's trying to explain what the first premises of practical reasoning or of a practical syllogism are. And her point of departure is looking at what Aristotle himself offers up as the first premises in practical reasoning. And she notes that they include words like should, suits, and pleasant. They either, I'm going to leave should out of it for the sake of simplicity, they either characterize something as pleasant. They don't need to use the term pleasant, but the concept that's used to talk about the beer, the cake. I had a delicious piece of cheesecake tonight. Using the term delicious brings it under a description where its pleasantness is evident, and now I have a reason to pursue the cheesecake as something to eat. Now, the other kind of thing of characterization that can go in the first premise of practical reason is suitability. If it suits me because I'm a person of such and such character or belonging to such and such group to do something as a member of that group or having that character, then that can be what gets a chain of practical reasoning going towards an action. Her example, and she self-consciously chooses this example because she says, I think Nazis are globally despised by everybody these days, so there's going to be no temptation to moralizing in this thought. She imagines what it would befit a Nazi to do on his dying day. And in her example, the Nazi's going to do some horrendous things to some Jewish children. Part of her point about talking about these desirability characterizations and suitability characterizations as one of the kinds of things that can feature as a desirability characterization, as the section goes along, you see, is that if we wanted to try to talk the Nazi out of doing the horrendous thing that he's going to do to the children, one of the things that she thinks stands a chance at being persuasive is bring the possibility of his action under another desirability characterization that fits him. And we all walk around the world with all kinds of identities. Even within the identity of being a Nazi, I think she suggests like, well, it also suits a Nazi to like sing patriotic songs on his dying day. Maybe go do that instead of the terrible thing to the kid, right? You would still be being a good Nazi. Or maybe you should be a good son right now, or a good something else, which requires you not to do these awful things to these children, but to go do something else, right? We all walk around belonging to various kinds of categories that belonging to those categories makes it suitable for us to do certain things in certain circumstances and not to do other things in other circumstances. Now, I think that that is what is in the back of her mind when she's talking about, it seems to me like it would be suitable. I think she says it's my function, but I think it's the same idea, to go buy a house and put it over there because it's needed there. It may suit, so I think that here's the connection I'm seeing. It may suit us, qua members of a capitalist society, to view decisions as being in the shop window and always seek to maximize our return. But it is not absurd for us, falling under some other description, any other description, it doesn't matter, one that is true, to do something else other than treat the entire world as if it is in the shop window where returns are to be maximized on the money that we've got. Okay, so tying all these three threads together, here is what my gloss on what Anscombe's argument is against the Economist, who simply think that the medieval argument against usury is absurd. That argument, the Economist, presupposes a distinction between a return, an investment, sorry, the medieval argument, forgive me. The medieval argument presupposes a distinction between a return of investment and a return on a loan. And that distinction, the Economist suppose, simply doesn't exist. Everything is simply a return. Everything is in the shop window, and you want the return to maximize as much as possible. Anscombe, the distinction only seems like it does not exist when all decisions are assumed to be shop window decisions. But sometimes it suits one to make a shop window decision, like if you're in fact in front of a shop window and trying to pick between two identical coats. And other times it suits you perhaps to do something else. Now, once again, I'm going to be a little self-congratulatory here that I'm on time. I didn't think I was going to get through all of this. I still think that this doesn't do anything to shore up the worry that I announced about 15 minutes ago, trying to make sense of this idea that using money on the conception that Aquinas gives us, her gloss of this as using it up, such that if I hand you a coin, I have used up the money and you have like gotten some new store of value, rather than the intuitive thing to say, which is there was one coin that moved hands and whatever value it had just kind of like moved along with the coin. How does any of this argument here, in attempting to disarm the Economist objection to usury, how does it help us make sense of that? I'm not sure that it does, but I think that what will help us make sense of it is if we make one more pass through another part of the Anscombean corpus, and that is to think about her essay on brute facts. And this shouldn't be a surprising place to look, because it's probably the most familiar place in her body of work where she discusses money. A central point of the essay, which she kicks right off here at the very beginning, it's a short essay, it was an analysis, is that the act of making a payment is not fully or adequately described by merely describing the transferring of metal discs from one hand to another. The description, if it were to be adequate to make sense of it as a payment, would have to include descriptions of the institutions that are the context in which the transfer counts as a payment. Anytime you're moving any money-ish things around, be they coins or paper notes or hitting a button on your phone to Venmo somebody some money, for that to be recognizable as a payment, as opposed to I hit a button on my phone and now we're good, or like I handed you a piece of metal and now we're good. In order to understand the act as a payment, as opposed to some physicalist description of the sort I just attempted to give, you're going to have to enrich the description with descriptions of the institutions that make that transferal a payment. The last thing to do to try to pull all these three threads together is to say that in a lot of instances, institutions are invisible. If an alien anthropologist came down without knowledge of institutions and tried to make sense of a spot payment in a market, they would be at a loss to describe what was going on when one thing changed hands and another did. Or maybe they wouldn't be at a loss, but they would form some hypothesis that could be a step towards understanding payment. But in order to understand payment, you need to understand the idea of debts being denominated in a certain way in certain kinds of things, namely money in the example of the market, being the ways of discharging those debts. There's a lot of rich description that the first time the alien anthropologist comes down to the farmer's market and stares at what's going on, they're not going to know what's going on. All of that is necessary in order to make sense of the particular act as an act of payment. Anscombe's broader issue here is Wittgensteinian about the roles of institutions for making sense of any kinds of the rich social actions that we make, having the meaning, and not just having the meaning, but falling under the descriptions that they do as a result of their presence in the kinds of institutions that are there. And she uses money as an example here, but it's particularly provocative example, especially coming back to this discussion that we have now about the medieval argument against usury. I think that it is interesting to her that her hero, Aquinas, was sensitive to the invisibility of institutions and could not need to say much about it or argue for, describe the role of the institutions in the virtual payment of the money, that so much could be, as she said earlier, just kind of obvious to him, where it ceases to be obvious to us. Now, I don't know if that saves the day on her way of thinking about money as being used up, but it at least connects it up with broader issues that she has in her thinking over the course of her career about the invisibility of the institutions that make our actions into the kinds of actions that they are. All right, so the thing that maybe made me laugh the most the past week while I was looking through the archive, her notebooks are full of her writing as if she is arguing, or not arguing, or presenting to a class or to a seminar or to her colleagues. But on one, just all of a sudden in the middle, she says, damn it, what is my point? And so it was nice to see her as perplexed by her own attempt to work through her thought as many of us are. My point has been that in this little essay that wasn't published in her own time, there is a lot of richness in thinking through the ontology of money and connected issues of debt. Richness that sometimes I think she had in mind and sometimes she did not have in mind, but it's part of the joy of going through and working through the scholarship of others to find that richness that maybe was there even unbeknownst to the thinker herself. So that's what I've got, and looking forward to the Q&A. Sure. Oh, sit, right. I guess we can leave it up in case anybody wants to see the slide.
Well, thank you so much for that stimulating and very interesting discussion. I wanted to kick things off with a couple of questions before going to the audience, and I wanted to come back to an issue you touched on briefly, that issue of risk that you discussed. Maybe get you to expand on that a little bit. So, of course, someone who's kind of a modern day market economist who thinks of the value of things in terms of market prices and whatnot would have a pretty standard response to the idea that there's nothing of value over and above the use of something like money or another commodity like wine. Of course, as you said, you're paying, the interest is based upon the risk that the usurer is incurring. It could be based on covering transaction costs. You're paying for the time you were deprived of its use since it has an immediate value. It's accounting for inflation, all these other things. And indeed, they would say, look, usury wouldn't exist if both parties didn't find it advantageous. Maybe this doesn't account for issues where the interest is exorbitant or kind of predatory, but that would indeed get us right back to that kind of modern day definition of usury as being an exorbitant interest on a loan. So I wonder, where do you think, how do you think Anscombe would handle that kind of response? Or if the response is wrong-headed, I think there's probably something fundamentally wrong with that. What would you say? What would be Anscombe's kind of take on that?
So I got misled a little bit at the beginning with the focus on risk. I feel like you listed several things that a contemporary defender of lending at interest might say in defense of the institution. Can you help reorient me by pointing me to one or another of them?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking. I was just kind of off the top of my head. I was thinking of that you're charging interest for the assumption of risk, for the effects of inflation, for covering possible transaction costs. It's a payment for the time you were deprived of the use of, say, either the commodity or the money. So I'm just off the top of my head was pointing to a variety of things that might justify the extra charge.
Right. So I think that she was, or that she must have been sensitive to some of these issues, because in the essay itself, she will say things like, well, maybe a little interest is needed in order to incentivize the money to circulate in the first place in a way that would be productive for society. She doesn't take the super hard line that any interest whatsoever would be out of bounds. I presume out of some recognition of the psychology of people's unwillingness to part with their money without seeing anything to come back in return. And, maybe giving away that little amount is already seeding more than her Aquinas would be willing to give. Part of the setup of the of explicating Aquinas's argument is, again, I think her real concern is with economists who simply think that the very notion of the distinction between the two kinds of return on investment is absurd. I mean, I think that's her real stalking horse here. So that she could be willing to be more concessive than the Aquinas that she paints as. So that's one thing that one might say about that. Another thing strategically she might do is what I was trying to do, which is move through case by case on what the arguments in favor of the justifiability or maybe even necessity of lending at interest are. The bit about risk, I think, ties into views that she has about the metaphysics of the future. And I think this is maybe one of the reasons that she's impressed by Aquinas's argument being a metaphysical argument as opposed to another one, is like, that's the way that she thinks that you should attack the problem. At near the end of intention, she says here, in the small activities of everyday life, I am going to, unless I am prevented, would be absurd, or excuse me, in the small activities of everyday life, to say I am going to, unless I am prevented, would be absurd, like putting, unless my memory deceives me after every report one gave of what had happened. So I think that she thinks it's just built into the nature of the future that we don't know what's going to happen. That's what makes the future as opposed to the past. Using that as, I think that she thinks that that's like, it's metaphysically strange to charge a rent on that basic fact about the way that existence through time is structured. I suppose the comeback is, nope, it's not. That's exactly what we do in the face of the fact that the metaphysics of time are structured that way. But I think that that's what's operating in the background when she says that risk is a monstrosity, at least for that particular point.
Well, great, thank you. Secondly, I wanted to ask maybe a question that gets to the history surrounding this issue. Aquinas obviously is so important to Catholic thinking on most issues, and he's one might say he's the patron saint of Catholic thought. And it seems it's interesting that in this particular area on usury, that even that not only modern thinking but even Catholic thinking as well seems to have, I don't know if you want to say, lost this bit of Aquinas, but has certainly moved away from it or downplayed it or diluted it. And of course, Anscombe was known for stepping into the breach against kind of losing some of these older ideas that should retain their traction. So, what do you think explains that on this particular issue, kind of that move away from Aquinas, whereas the Church and kind of Catholic thinking is much more tethered to him, has remained tethered to his lines of thought in most ways? Yeah.
I mean, you're asking me to do the very thing I said I wasn't going to do, which is speculate about the history of the Church. I can report, to the extent that I know her story, that I think that her account has to do with with colonialism, and in particular, what missionaries found themselves doing as they entered. And I think China is the place that she cites as an example in particular. And the practices there where there weren't any, that she didn't encounter the prohibitions on usury. So for the Church to get a foothold, had to go with the customs that were there, that this worked its way back into Rome as a permissive attitude. If I'm remembering correctly, the story is something like that. Now, I keep looking at Joe and being like, Joe, did I get that right? Do you remember? Yeah. There's a couple things to say about that. If that is her view, and okay, so at this part of the project, it's simply explanatory. So that doesn't mean that she's defending the actions, right? Something else that she is very keenly interested in right at this time in her life, in the late 60s and early 70s, are practices of simony in Africa, where Catholic churches are charging people to have their kids, or it's not have their kids baptized, it's grown-ups going through what when I was a kid was the confirmation process, but right, you're old enough to be able to assent to the doctrines of the church, and then having to pay a fine to do so, and defending the practice by saying, no, the money is for the upkeep of the church. And moreover, the folks who pay know it's for the upkeep of the church, and it's inculcating good practices of donating to the church. And her argument against those practices of simony is it's the same one that she makes against Truman and the bomb, which is basically you can't say a little speech in your head and make something into something it's not. If you're paying, and that's a necessary condition on you getting baptized, it's simony, right? So I suspect, not defending the practice, but in explaining the practice, that she thought something similar happened in the colonial spread of Catholicism several centuries beforehand. I think that's the story in there. But the other thing that she talks about as making people in general, not just the economists that she wants to rake over the coals, comfortable with the idea that there's just nothing at all wrong, mysterious about giving your money away with an expectation that it would that you would get a return of investment just for like sticking it somewhere else and then getting it in return, is the rise of stock markets and modern capitalism in the middle of the 18th century. That like the whole experience of investing money in the stock markets is giving your money away, having no idea exactly where it's going to, what happens to it, and hoping that you get something in the mail, or when there are computers, something that comes back saying that the number is bigger than when you put it out. She doesn't connect that up with the Catholic experience, but if you think of the church as being completely aware of what's going on with that aspect of the way that capitalism is being financed in the 18th and 19th century, then it would hardly be surprising if the church would be caught up in the wake of that as well. One more thought on that. I think it's really interesting that when she tries to make Aquinas's view as convincing as possible, that the metaphor she turns to is of a seed and growing, because seeds, like that's just the way we talk about investing, right? You know, you grow your capital by investing in something. She had to have been deliberate about that, which I think only makes getting what she takes to be Aquinas's intuition even harder for us to get our head around.
Thank you. Let's open it up to the room now. Any questions? Yes.
So I was hoping that you'd make the connection between the using it up idea and the invisible institutions a little more explicit. And I'm going to suggest one way that I was thinking the connection might go. So I was struck by as a modern moral philosopher myself, I was struck by the metaphysical nature of the arguments that both Aristotle and Aquinas are given.
Yeah.
For me, they have a certain sort of like, well, so what if the way in which I use this doesn't suit Patilo's?
Right.
Who do I wrong?
Right.
But then I was also struck by the way in which these metaphysical arguments are very different for each of them, right? So for Aristotle, it really is the teleological arguments. And then for Aquinas, it's this other thing, right? There's something metaphysically mistaken about charging for the use because you've used it up, or like a habit or something like
right.
that. So I was wondering if the way of making sense of that idea has to do with the invisible institutions, that the way in which this is a metaphysical, right? So here's the question. So in what way is Aquinas's problem that he encounters when thinking about usury, in what way is that a metaphysical issue? It seems to be a metaphysical issue. It certainly doesn't seem straightforwardly like a moral issue in the sense of modern moral philosophy.
That's right.
So what is the problem?
Okay, so if there is a problem with usury, it's supposed to be the same problem as charging rent on a consumable good. And maybe in the way that I presented it, I skipped over the basic and important thought about what one owns when one owns a consumable good. I think that what Aquinas is thinking is something like, let me see if this works. There's no gap between a consumable object described as such and a consumable object described as a potentiality where the potentiality is whatever would be realized by the consumption. That is one and the same thing. So to confer a property right of a consumable good from one person to another, either through gifting or selling or whatever other way that the right is justly conferred, what is conferred is just one thing, but that one thing can be brought under two descriptions, either the thing itself with no mention of the potential for its use, or the one that explicates the potential for the use. So to try to sell both of them would be, one of those two things doesn't exist. You know, I think it's arbitrary, pick which one, right? But there aren't two things there, there's just one. So that's supposed to be intuitively clear when it comes to the property rights that attach to these things that would then be involved with selling, which is then in turn, so that much I can kind of, I felt like I said that out loud clearly enough. Now that is supposed to be the basis for saying, if you lend something that has that kind of nature, there's again only just one thing that passes by. There's a principle of equality working in the background that what you get when you lend, what would be an equal return on the thing that you lent is just that thing itself. So that's where you might want to get off the board and be like, no, you opportunity cost and risk and all this other stuff, you gave away much more than just the thing itself. And that's what you need to be, paid for effectively. But I don't think Aquinas is thinking that. I think he thinks all you gave was the bottle of wine or whatever. And that money is like a bottle of wine, so that what you get in return, if you get any more of the thing in return than what you gave, then you're getting a return on a something else. And the metaphysics come in by saying there is nothing else there, right? Okay, that was a really helpful question. Did that state it more clearly than I presented it? Yeah.
That's super helpful. And
Okay.
it also makes me realize I'm sort of mistaken to treat this as a merely metaphysical objection.
Okay.
Right, because there is a moral principle. It has to do
Right,
with
yes,
something to do with equality. It's that you've taken or given something.
Yes. Yeah. Good. The moral principle in the background, I think, is a principle of equality. Again, the discussion of usury occurs in a broader discussion of justice, and Aquinas is trying to figure out all different sorts of justice. And so this would be in the category of the kind of justice that Aristotle discusses in 5.5 of Nicomachean Ethics, where he's trying to figure out what any kind of just exchanges are, right? That kind of justice, which is equality in exchange. Except we're not just talking about exchange, we're talking about exchange extended through the process of lending. And maybe that's helpful, is to think that maybe it's the case that Aquinas doesn't see, or this argument makes sense if you think that there's nothing to lending beyond just an exchange that's drawn out in time. So if the fair price and the market would be the trivial price of trading something for exactly itself, which no one would do because you already have the thing, but that would be fair. Each party would end up with exactly the equivalent to the thing that they parted ways with, that you're just spreading that out over time, but that there's no price to put on the time in between, which again sounds like every contemporary economist is immediately going to get off the boat there. Great, thanks for the question. Yes.
Thank you for that. That was very informative. I'm curious what you think, whether Anscombe would give praise, if any, to trust as something that is part of the ontology of money. When you brought up the example of the medieval village, it really got me thinking, like, that interaction itself, where the people who are trading have no connection to like this physical store of money, but they still hold it in their minds as something that can be exchanged. That whole interaction is really premised on a sense of trust.
Yeah.
They're knowing each other, whereas our modern economy is premised on actually trying to get rid of that dependence on trust. You see things like blockchain and other things. And it also, these medieval prohibitions, I think, are also getting at something different from like older Hebrew prohibitions on usury, which are, they strike me as being dependent on some sort of sense of violation of trust happening, whereas the medieval ones are not. I'm wondering, do you think that Anscombe would acknowledge trust as being something Again, part of that ontology.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because a theory of money, or a tradition of theorizing about money of which she seems unaware, which is a little weird because she's interacting with Joan Robinson, who would have been aware of this strand of Keynesianism, is what today is called the credit theory of money, which is all about money as an expression of debt and credit, which depends upon the trustworthiness of debtors and creditors in order to, or either the trustworthiness or the enforced trustworthiness through coercive punishment on individuals to pay their loans back. So there's your question is striking a chord with contemporary ways of thinking about money. That it's I don't think the word comes up once in her essay, which is really, really remarkable. And I think it probably doesn't come up in her essay because she doesn't find issues of trust to be anything that occur in these relevant passages of Aristotle and Aquinas. Now, I know the Aristotle a lot better than the Aquinas. Aristotle says, I think quite reasonably, that the use of coinage had only been invented like a couple hundred years before Aristotle is writing. It's a brand new technology, but the use of pieces of precious metal in ports of exchange is much older than that. And he opines that the use of be it, and I can't remember whether he uses the term coin here or not, but it doesn't matter. The use of precious metal as a medium of exchange must have come up in these kinds of trade situations because you're going long distances and the cow's going to die before you get it back or whatever, right? So Aristotle's thoughts about where money comes from, what's its purpose is, occur in context where trust is at a minimum. Some stranger has showed up and is going to give you some stuff and you're going to give them something in response and you may never see them again. You need to get things as equal as possible right then, because you're in a context where, unlike living in a village where you're going to see people all the time, where trust is at a minimum. So I think that's why in Aristotle, you don't see much discussion of trust at this spot in the discussion of money. But I don't know about Aquinas. I mean, in the, yeah, I don't recall in the usury section anything about trust coming up. And I think that's really curious because he's certainly possible that he could be thinking about those things in lockstep with one another. I don't know. Thank you. I'm not sure about what to say about Aquinas, but I feel pretty confident about what I said about Aristotle. Yes.
So I have a bunch of random things to say. I don't know how well I'll be able to tie them together, but I tried. So I think the trust and risk questions are really related. I found it interesting that Anscombe seems to directly consider the question of the necessity and inevitability of usury in a society, and particularly at the end where she talks about how usury is to some extent necessary in any like stock market type of system. So she also the with regard to the distinction between investment with a shared return versus a loan with a like fixed interest rate. It seems to me that that you could say, well, so I think I agree with Anscombe that when the opportunity presents itself, you could argue persuasively that it's suitable for the person to invest with a shared return, and that's a compelling way to compelling alternative to getting out of loan. I think the trouble arises when there's asymmetries in people's ability to invest in a profitable venture with a predictable return, and there's asymmetries specifically within particular sets of people who are investing in something together. So as a result, people who would like to be able to invest their money would rather offload that money to someone else who has a more clear understanding of what they might be investing in, or more experienced investor, that sort of thing. And the incentive for that is the interest rate. So given that Anscombe, and I think probably Aquinas and Aristotle may agree, I'm not sure, that in a society where there's a variety of investments to be made, but there's asymmetries in people's abilities to make those investments in intelligent ways, that usury is the price of that in an economy to incentivize people to allocate wealth in that sort of way. And the other thing that struck me was that the question that Aristotle, when he is thinking of the telos of money, it seems to me a strange starting point to start with the telos of money as like an a priori assumption about the role of money, rather than going the other direction, which is like what are the desirable outcomes of a market, and how then it ought money to be used in order to achieve that, given that money is a human concept.
Yeah, so on the first point, I'll say briefly for anybody who reads the essay, something I glossed over because I couldn't find the argument for it. Anscombe says that she makes some remarks about the necessity of communism in here. She lays some cards down on the table that I didn't know that she was holding about her views on, again, not just the desirability, but the necessity of communism. Now, it seems to me like, from what I could tell, she has a, I'm going to call it a crude theory of value operating in the background that is pushing her to think that communism would be a necessary outcome. Some like capitalism is going to destroy itself sort of thing. I can't vouch for that because she doesn't put that card down on the table, and I don't know if she knows to put that card down on the table. There's two versions of this essay, and in the first version, she had more things to say about communism and took them out. I don't know if she was feeling less certain about her views about that. But I imagine from the necessity of communism comments and seeing the role of stock markets as producing this view of everything being in the shop window, that she would sign on for all the stuff that you said as your first point, that this just is the way that it is with capitalism, and then add, and that's a problem, and it's going to end. So that's speculating a little bit about how to read from the text onto the comment that you made. As for the second one, Aristotle, there's no invisible hand in Aristotle. The hands are very visible. So you would you find yourself in market-y circumstances and think, this sucks. This isn't going as well as it should go. I don't always have pigs when people need pigs. I got to come up with something to make trade easier. Ta-da, coins. So the telos emerges out of the necessity of the activity because the activity is not going as well as you would have wanted it to. So, I mean, that's why both what you think the telos is and why you think the telos gets to be what it is. And for what it's worth, that story gets told by over and over and over again in the history of economic theorizing. You can open Carl Menger and he tells about the same story almost 2,000 years later.
So of the maybe this is to return to John Peters' opening question about the earlier in your lecture, which was really terrific. Thank you. But you were going to bracket the possible objections of opportunity cost and risk. I think you said like risk that's just not on the table for them because they ruled it out for a variety of reasons. Right? But opportunity cost, I think you were suggesting in response to John Peter that Anscombe does seem to have kind of some space for thinking about, even if Aquinas didn't, because she thought maybe some interest would be possible just to get money to start flowing, right? Because otherwise, why wouldn't you hold on to it, right, for whatever else might come up that you might need it for, right?
Right.
So I guess just to ask for a little bit more of the, for you to unpack maybe the implications of that concession a little bit more. Is that, and to go back to the sort of shop window point, is she still then suggesting though that it has such a limited place, the idea of lending money and interest, that it would just be kind of among households, right? Rather than say, allow for a kind of industry focused on lending money. Because then sort of it sets up a sort of shop window situation where you have a variety of people who are willing to lend money at interest, right? And just you know, at the highest rate that they might be willing to get.
Yeah. So
and I guess sort of in effect, then does she rule out basically the whole industry of finance?
Yeah.
Right? Even if she allows for a certain amount.
I don't know, but I think that the point earlier about the ways in which Anscombe I guess in her theology was frequently trying to claw back to Aquinas to push back on modern changes, those changes of the last 900 years or whatever, could be, there's a whole lot of I don't know here, but here's a thought that one might have. That might be at odds with those pragmatist aspects of her philosophy that come from Wittgenstein, that is on full display here when she's talking about brute facts, and brute facts only being facts in the context of institutions. Well, institutions are historically contingent. They change over time. So the institutions about money that surrounded Aquinas when he's writing the Summa might be so radically different from the institutions that one finds oneself in, whatever stage of capitalism she would have considered herself in, or whatever stage we want to consider ourselves in. To think that the way of theorizing money in Aquinas' time just can't be the way that we theorize money in our time. And in fact, turning that crank one more time, maybe there was nothing wrong for Aristotle to have theorized money as primarily and necessarily a medium of exchange as he experienced it in the institutions that were relevant to the Athens of his time, and that things are already sufficiently different for Aquinas' institutions to make intelligible the view that he's got. So an out for her could be, look, none of this justifies the income inequality that we see today. And, we can take the mere fact that we exist in capitalism doesn't justify the income inequality that we see today. It doesn't justify the various kinds of any specific lending procedure, but it may be that we can't but use money in any other way than we happen to right now, because it's so deeply embedded in the particular historical institutions that we've got right now. And those institutions include sufficient concern about risk and a motivational structure that if we're going to get the ball rolling at all, we need to allow for a little bit of interest on loans that might have been unrecognizable to Aquinas. So the way out then is just to say our institutions are so different from Aquinas that all the stuff I was teaching you about Aquinas at the beginning of the paper doesn't roll over neatly to where we are now. It would be interesting, to use her word again, if she's willing to do that with these kinds of socioeconomic issues, but unwilling to do it with theological issues, where it seems like she sticks her foot in the ground more and is like, no, we need to go back and do it the way that Aquinas did it. I don't know, that's a good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, kind of like a follow-up on that. So is her point on the institution in the background and the difference that comes up in the description of the investment and loans, if I heard you correctly, about the brute facts, are these points like theoretical and not ethical? And if so, then maybe like why does she diverge from talks about injustice and then?
Yeah, good. So I think it's part of Anscombe's broad project as a virtue theorist to cut the distinction between the ethical and the theoretical. There's something fact, like what it is to murder somebody has a factive component and it has an evaluative component. That's just what murder is. I think that she thinks of would think of usury in the same vein. it's just part of the broader virtue theoretic project to not separate those things out, but to say the proper way of doing normative theory is to have it metaphysically infused, and the proper way of doing social metaphysics is to take all the virtue theoretic consequences on board rather than try and hive them off and let the ethicists do the ethical work later. There is no ethical work to be done later if you're getting the descriptions of the actions right.
Right. So would she then be a sort of relativist in terms of like the normative components dependency on like the institutions at the time?
I have no idea what to say about that. I feel like it is a very natural reading of what she commits herself to when she's got her philosophy hat squarely tugged tight on her head. And then when she puts her theology hat on, it sure doesn't look that way at all. And I don't know how her head managed to put both of those hats on. So as a person, I'm not entirely sure. There are people who probably have come through here or will come through here who will have much clearer views on that than I do. I have always read the philosophy as creating a space for a pretty a radical form of at least historical relativism, right? Not individual relativism, because you're a product of the historical moment that you're in, and that's what gives you the language that you've got. But yeah, maybe it makes sense that the only way to get beyond that would be faith, because reason isn't going to do it for you, but I'm not entirely sure.
How are we doing on time?
All right, great.
Well, let me then be the one to thank Dr. Hubbs once again for a fantastic talk and a very interesting Q&A. And if we could all give him a round of applause.